A motel clerk disappears, leaving behind a trail of blood. Investigators have their suspect, but without a victim, what can they charge him with? A shooting is reported, but investigators have no proof that it really occurred. Until they can sift fact from fiction, they haven't got a case. Is a missing sofa the key to a woman's disappearance? The prosecution can't rest until it can make sense of a series of odd clues. Murder is usually the most obvious of crimes. The victims' bodies mute witnesses to violence. But their silent testimony may go unheard when they disappear without a trace. Memphis, Tennessee, a thriving southern city. Home of Beale Street, the Blues, and Elvis Presley. But in 1997, it played host to a deadly mystery. In the early morning hours of February 8th, a man arrived at a Memphis motel. He became concerned when calls to the front desk went unanswered. He went to check it out.
Hello?
The clerk appeared to be missing.
Hello?
He didn't see anyone in the lobby, but there was blood on the counter. The office security door was open, and he noticed more blood on the frame. Convinced something was wrong, he left and called police. When Memphis police arrived, they discovered blood outside the motel entrance. Smearing indicated something had been dragged across the pavement. They found more clues inside. While the office showed no sign of forced entry, the cash register was open and empty.
Why is the register out?
But a purse lying undisturbed nearby caught their attention. They didn't believe a woman would willingly leave it behind. The wallet inside still contained money, as well as a checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license in the name of Ricky Ellsworth. Alerted by police, the motel manager arrived and confirmed that Ricky Ellsworth was the clerk on duty. She said Ricky lived nearby with her husband, Don, and 2 children. A trusted, reliable employee, she wasn't the sort to just leave in the middle of her shift. Circumstances of the crime suggested more than robbery. Police suspected the clerk had been abducted. As police processed the scene, other significant details began to emerge. The office security door was equipped with a keypad, but it was open and showed no sign of tampering. Either someone had known the code or the clerk had unlocked the door. To investigators, that suggested Ricky Ellsworth might have known her abductor.
So fingerprints, those are going to be fingerprints.
Let's go check back.
Although
around.
police had begun to suspect foul play, nothing prepared them for what they found in an adjacent bathroom. There were signs of a desperate struggle and much more blood. The running sink contained a small flashlight, and the toilet seat had been ripped from its hinges. Wet, blood-tinged sheets indicated someone had tried to clean the room. Not only had Ricky Ellsworth disappeared, but it now seemed she'd been seriously injured. Captain R.G. Moore, who led the crime scene unit, feared the worst.
When we don't have a body and we don't know exactly what happened, we'd handle it just like it's going to be a homicide case. We process the scene, we collect our blood sample, we collect all the evidence we can find from the scene, and just keep it until we see what we got.
Investigators hoped the evidence would lead them to Ricky. A squad car brought the victim's husband, Don Ellsworth, to the motel. He said he and Ricky were happily married. He told police his wife was a kind person who worked with a Christian prison ministry in her spare time. Every Christmas, she baked pies for the prisoners. But Ellsworth said their marriage hadn't always been so tranquil. They'd once separated for 2 years, and she'd gotten involved with a man who assaulted her and went to prison for it. Ellsworth said the man's name was Michael Rimmer. After finishing at the scene, the investigators returned to the station to conduct a background check on Michael Rimmer. What they found in the files was chilling. Rimmer was a high school dropout with a history of drug problems and violence. In 1989, he was convicted of robbing and brutally assaulting Ricky Ellsworth. Details of Rimmer's previous assault on Ricky raised Detective Robert Shemwell's suspicions.
His actions at that crime basically mirrored what was happening here at the motel with the cleaning up, or attempt to clean up the evidence. We immediately began looking for Michael Rimmer.
Meanwhile, detectives narrowed the time frame for Ricky's disappearance. They found a couple who had checked in with her at 1:15 a.m. But when 2 others tried to check out around 2:30, she wasn't there. Detectives located a witness who said he pulled into the motel at approximately 2:15, hoping to rent a room. But he saw a man with bloody knuckles behind the counter and left without registering. He also noticed a 4-door maroon car backed up to the curb, its trunk and doors open. Based on his description, police put together a composite of the man at the motel. Using an identikit, a collection of facial parts and features that can be assembled as needed, the suspect's face came together. It resembled Michael Rimmer. Detectives then asked the witness to look through an album of more than 50 mugshots, including Rimmer's. Their hopes were dashed when he couldn't positively identify Rimmer as the man with the bloody knuckles. Detectives learned from a co-worker that Ricky had recently gotten a birthday card from a Michael in Mississippi. She took the card into the back office to read, but became angry and threw it away. It was becoming clear to detectives that if they wanted to find Ricky Ellsworth, they needed to find Michael Rimmer. They started at the auto repair shop where he worked. Nobody had seen him since Friday, the day before Ricky disappeared. He'd left his tools and paycheck behind. One more critical fact emerged.
When we got to talking to the employees there, this same maroon 4-door vehicle was described as being Michael Rimmer's car. So then we decided we need to track down and find out where Michael Rimmer got this 4-door maroon vehicle.
It wasn't registered to Rimmer. If it wasn't his, detectives wondered where he'd gotten it. His co-workers sent detectives to another friend of Rimmer's who told them that his own maroon 4-door car had been stolen a month earlier, shortly after he'd last seen Rimmer. After 4 days, Ricky Ellsworth was still missing, and so was Michael Rimmer. Hoping for a clue to his whereabouts, police questioned his brother. Richard Rimmer said he'd last seen Michael on the morning of February 9th, just hours after Ricky Ellsworth disappeared. Michael had seemed exhausted when he arrived in the maroon car around 9:30 a.m. He asked Richard if he knew how to remove a blood stain from the back seat. Then, Michael pulled a muddy shovel from the car and scraped mud from his boots. Richard also told police that Michael claimed Ricky bought the car for him. She had visited Rimmer in prison after he claimed he'd found God. And Richard knew the two had met after his release. But somewhere along the line, the friendship soured. By now, 2 weeks had passed, and still nobody had seen or heard from Ricky Ellsworth. Detectives had lost hope of finding her alive, and their prime suspect, Michael Rimmer, still eluded them. They would have to find him and the stolen car if they had any chance of proving murder.
I issued a theft of property warrant on Michael Rimmer and indicated in that warrant that when he was located, or if that vehicle was located, that it was to be held for the Memphis Homicide Unit and processed.
Detectives got a promising lead from one of Rimmer's former cellmates. He said Rimmer spoke of killing Ricky and burying her in Mississippi after he got out of prison. Rimmer's former girlfriend told detectives of a wooded area called Plantation Point near Arca-Butler Lake in Mississippi. It was 45 minutes from Memphis. She said Rimmer liked to go there. Detectives headed to Plantation Point. They combed the area on foot, but didn't find anything. Then they called in blackwater divers from the Shelby County Search and Rescue Unit. Specially trained to operate by touch in dark, murky black water, the divers searched the lake. They didn't find anything either. Detectives were thoroughly frustrated. They chased down every witness and lead, but were no closer to solving the case or finding Ricky Ellsworth or Michael Rimmer. Now they'd run out of options. In Memphis, nearly a month had passed with no progress in the potential homicide case. In early March, detectives got a phone call from Johnson County, Indiana. A sheriff's deputy there had stopped a maroon car for speeding. When he ran a check on the license plate, he discovered the car was stolen and there was a warrant for the driver. Michael Rimmer, sought for crimes including robbery and possible murder, had been arrested during a routine traffic stop. Detectives flew to Indiana, prepared to finally question Rimmer and examine the car for evidence. After obtaining a warrant, forensic investigators with the Johnson County Crime Unit searched the car. They hoped for solid evidence, but never expected to find what they did.
Numerous receipts, hotel receipts, pawn shop receipts, restaurant receipts, showing Mike's every step from the day Ricky came up missing till his actual apprehension.
Investigators tested the stained back seat for human blood. Results were positive. It was their first physical evidence to suggest a connection between Rimmer and the crime. Memphis detectives questioned Michael Rimmer over the next 2 days. He denied stealing the car or having anything to do with Ricky's disappearance. So far, all their evidence was circumstantial. Without Ricky's body, there was only one way to link Rimmer to her murder.
The blood from the rear of the vehicle Michael Rimmer was occupying and the blood from the scene matched. We had a problem though. We had to determine or show somehow that that blood was Ricky Ellsworth's blood.
They had one chance, a reverse paternity DNA test which uses the combined DNA traits passed on from parents to determine the DNA characteristics of their children. Forensic scientists compared blood from Ricky's mother to samples from the crime scene and the maroon car. They matched. The test established a 16 million to 1 probability that blood from the car and motel came from an offspring of Ricky's mother. It was the final link police needed to prove murder. Michael Rimmer's guilt was written in blood. Based on evidence, police believe they know what happened on February 8th. Michael Rimmer drove to the motel sometime around 1:30 a.m., knowing Ricky Ellsworth would be alone. When he arrived, she let him into the office. There, Rimmer exploded into violence, attacking her, then wrapping her body in sheets. Afterward, he tried to clean the room, but gave up and left the sink running. Dragging Ricky to his car, Rimmer made his escape. Although her body was never found, police believe Ricky Ellsworth is buried somewhere near Arca Butler Lake. Michael Rimmer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While no body was ever found in the Rimmer case, police used blood evidence to prove murder. But in Cleveland, Ohio, police would have to build a case on even less. On Saturday, December 15, 1984, Cleveland police were called to the home of Ernestine Campbell. She reported that her brother, Henry, was missing, and she feared for his life because she'd heard he'd been shot and his body hidden in an alley. She told police she'd last seen Henry the night before when he'd left home for a nearby after-hours spot. Officers searched the alley, but didn't find a body. In fact, they didn't find any signs of foul play. They drove through the neighborhood, but didn't see anything unusual. There was no sign of Henry Campbell, and nothing to indicate a violent crime had occurred. Officers canvassed the area, talking to residents who might have seen or heard something the night before. One witness claimed she heard shots and saw men running near the club. Another recalled hearing shots, but couldn't provide any other details. Still others confirmed shots were fired, but nobody admitted seeing anything. Police were frustrated. They had reports of gunfire and a murder, but couldn't find the purported victim. Homicide Detective John Qualey, the lead investigator, recalls the odd circumstances of the case.
Well, usually we're called to the scene of a homicide where we have a victim laying on the street or in a house, but we have a victim. And a lot of times we'll be able to get the weapon used in a crime. With this incident, a murder was reported, we went to the scene, we didn't have a body. We couldn't find the body, we couldn't find any evidence of blood, or we didn't have a weapon. It was kind of starting without anything to work with.
Police needed more information, so they returned to the Campbell house. Ernestine gave them a picture of Henry and more details. She'd heard that some people claimed they'd seen Clarence Barnes shoot her brother in the back. She said Barnes ran the after-hours club in his home and that there was bad blood between him and Henry.
Hi, Miss Richardson. Sorry.
At the station, people who had been at the club that night began coming forward. A woman named Jacqueline Richardson told investigators she saw Campbell at the club and that he argued with Barnes.
Now, you understand? I mean now. Yeah, it has to be that way. Out of here now.
When Campbell left, Barnes, who had a gun, followed him outside.
You better get off me, man. Stay out of my house. I told you to stay out of my house.
She said the two men were joined by a third and walked out of her sight. Shortly after that, a woman ran into the club, screaming that there'd been a shooting and Henry Campbell was injured.
The other first two, or was it
Richardson went outside, where a passerby told her some men were chasing and shooting at another.
all three?
She said she didn't see anything and returned to the club.
With the gun?
Barnes was already there, asking everyone to leave.
Okay, Mr. Santiago.
As the search continued for evidence of murder, Victor Santiago told police
With
what
those
he
people
knew.
that night?
No.
He was the third man Jacqueline Richardson had described, and his account took up where hers left off.
Give your home. You don't care. If you don't care, I don't care who your boys are.
He said he'd seen the two men arguing outside the club and heard Barnes order Campbell to leave. According to Santiago, Campbell caught up with him a few moments later. As they walked down the street, he heard a shot and Campbell fell forward. Santiago said he took cover, then watched Barnes fire 3 more shots at the prostrate Campbell. Police now had 2 eyewitness accounts, but still no evidence of a homicide. Henry Campbell had disappeared, and detectives had 2 eyewitness accounts of murder, but no body and no evidence. Several residents claimed Clarence Barnes bragged that he'd burned Campbell's body and that nobody would ever find him.
Ask a few questions.
Investigators brought Barnes to the station for questioning.
Let's take the chair on your left.
He admitted having words with Campbell and asking him to leave, but said he didn't know what happened after that. He denied having anything to do with Campbell's disappearance. When police asked Barnes what he did for a living, he told them he worked at the Animal Resource Center at a local university. That immediately rang a bell in Qualey's mind, and he called Barnes's supervisor.
We asked him if he had an incinerator in the school. And he said, oh, yes. And we asked him how big it was. He said it was big enough to incinerate a steer. We told him then that we were investigating a homicide and that possibly there may be human remains in the incinerator, and asked him if he would seal the room. He did.
The next morning, detectives and a team of forensic investigators went to the Animal Resource Center, believing they might find the remains of Henry Campbell. While the facility director arranged access to the incinerator, the security chief showed them surveillance video from the night Campbell disappeared. It showed Barnes arriving around 3:30 a.m. He backed into the receiving area, which was approximately 15 feet from the incinerator entrance. Police could see him carrying something toward the incinerator room, but couldn't identify what it was.
The picture then jumped away and came back, and the next picture was the incinerator door open and Clarence pushing a cart in there. You could not see what was on the cart, but we knew he was in the incinerator room at that hour.
When investigators saw the incinerator, they knew they were in for a long, complicated task. Dr. Elizabeth Balraj, coroner of Cuyahoga County, recalls the challenge.
There were 100 gallons of cremated ashes containing the remains from various animals. And we had to sift through those and find a very small amount of human bones.
If human bones were to be found at all. The team began the painstaking process of sifting through the incinerator contents. Using a fine mesh screen, they collected fragments of bone and other unburned debris. Though most of the fragments were tiny and charred, some appeared to be human, including a vertebra, mandible, and part of a pelvis. They also found a piece of melted lead. Its size and mass were consistent with a .38 caliber bullet. It was the first solid evidence of murder. Although investigators believed they'd found Henry Campbell, their case would go up in smoke if they couldn't prove it. They turned to Dr. C. Owen Lovejoy, a biological anthropologist at Kent State University and an expert at identifying altered or damaged remains. He applied his skills to making a positive identification from the incomplete and severely damaged bone fragments. Lovejoy concurred with Dr. Balraj that approximately 160 of the recovered bones were human. The next step was determining whether they came from one person and whether that person was Henry Campbell. The process would be complicated by their condition.
Here, the pieces of the puzzle, all of the edges had been frayed, as you will, by the cremation process. And so none of the pieces fit together, and we had to look at them in an isolated state.
After a thorough inventory of the fragments, Lovejoy determined that portions of an entire skeleton were present. No bones were duplicated. That told Lovejoy the remains came from a single individual. But was it Henry Campbell? Next, he would try to establish specifics about the individual. Investigators had recovered part of the pelvis, which is diagnostic for both sex and age. Lovejoy concluded the remains belonged to a male, approximately Henry Campbell's age. While detectives were closer to proving they'd found Campbell, they needed positive identification. But Lovejoy couldn't give them that, not without more to go on.
Whenever we have a candidate individual that we believe the skeletal remains might match, what we do is we try to get a premortem X-ray.
Investigators delivered existing X-rays of Henry Campbell to Dr. Lovejoy. Could they help him prove murder? As Cleveland detectives sought to identify the bones found in the incinerator, Dr. Owen Lovejoy compared post-mortem X-rays and bone fragments with Campbell's radiographs. He focused on the skull, hand, and mandible. One recovered cranial fragment had a BB embedded in it. That matched an X-ray taken when Henry Campbell had accidentally been shot years earlier. Lovejoy also identified shared characteristics between Campbell's other X-rays and corresponding bone fragments. But he found the most compelling correlations in the lower mandible, or jawbone.
And the outline of that jaw, the details of the bone structure, and the details of the root areas where the teeth had been prior to death, all were configured in such a way that they indicated that this was a positive identification.
Since the jaw figured so prominently in that identification, Dr. Elizabeth Robinson, the team's forensic odontologist, reviewed Lovejoy's conclusions. In her opinion, two significant findings bolstered his analysis. The end of the jawbone was flat, a unique defect present in Henry Campbell's jaw. A second anomaly, an area of intense calcification, clinched the identification.
And it was in exactly the same area that it was on the postmortem as on the antemortem. It was also only 5 millimeters in size. In other words, it's the exact same size, same area, and on both X-rays.
With the positive identification, investigators had literally pulled proof of a homicide from the ashes. On December 21st, less than 1 week after Henry Campbell was reported missing, Barnes was officially charged with murder. Based on the evidence, police believe Barnes followed Campbell from his after-hours club, shot him, then hid his body. Later that night, Barnes took Campbell's body to the Animal Resource Center, where he incinerated it. In April of 1985, Clarence Barnes pled guilty to the murder of Henry Campbell. He received 15 years to life for aggravated murder. In Cleveland, police had to sift their case from a pile of ashes. In Maryland, investigators followed a winding trail of clues to capture a killer. Rockville, Maryland, August 10, 1988. 17-year-old Kai Lau returned early from a California vacation at the behest of a family friend to check on his mother, Lisa Tu. He hadn't heard from her in nearly a month, and others told him they hadn't heard from her either. That wasn't like his mother. When he and his mother's friend found no sign of Lisa in the house, they contacted police. They went to the Special Investigations Office at the Montgomery County Police Department to report her missing.
Great, thanks. You're welcome. Detective Turner?
Yes.
Hi.
Kai informed officers that nobody had seen or heard from his mother for a month.
Yes, the reason I called is...
He said that his stepfather, Gregory II, might know more, but he was overseas on business and Kai didn't know how to reach him. Before Gregory left, he told friends that Lisa had flown to San Francisco to visit a friend in the hospital. Kai said it was unusual for his mother to go away without telling anyone except Gregory. Police promised to investigate.
Anything look suspicious up there?
They began by contacting the airlines. Records confirmed that a one-way ticket had been purchased for LL2 on July 13th. The destination was San Francisco via a connecting flight in Los Angeles. The ticket to Los Angeles had been used, but not the one for San Francisco. It appeared Lisa, too, wasn't planning to come back.
This is the one.
That was her right, but the detectives needed to make one more call. They contacted the friend Lisa was supposed to be visiting in San Francisco. She said she hadn't been in the hospital, wasn't expecting Lisa, and hadn't talked to her in months. Now, detectives began to consider whether Lisa, too, intended to disappear, or if there might be a more sinister explanation. Detective Roger Thompson worked the case.
It was not the normal missing person case where we know somebody's missing for a particular reason. They may not contact family members, but we sooner or later find them. This had some mystery to it.
To find out more, detectives spoke to several of Lisa's friends and learned the twos had been married nearly 10 years. It was the second marriage for both, and Kai Lau was Lisa's son from her previous marriage. The twos had enjoyed the good life. Gregory was a successful restaurateur. In fact, one of his restaurants had been a favorite of Washington's elite. But it hadn't lasted. He'd suffered business reversals and lost his restaurants. A commissioned sales job couldn't support the family's affluent lifestyle. Gregory and Lisa argued about money, and their marriage was rocky. Police also learned that Lisa was romantically involved with another man. Police questioned him at his office. He said he spoke to Lisa the afternoon of July 14th, the last day anyone saw or heard from her. He denied knowing anything about a trip to San Francisco and expressed concern over Lisa's sudden disappearance. He indicated Lisa's husband was suspicious about their relationship. When he passed a polygraph test, investigators believed he was telling the truth. Detectives checked out the family's finances and saw indications of serious problems. Gregory was $30,000 in debt. Detective Mike Turner realized too was under a lot of pressure.
Gregory was known to like to gamble, and we determined that he, through interviews with friends, had accrued some debt in gambling that he had not been able to pay. And this was another problem that arose with his relationship with Lisa.
Detectives also learned Lisa Too's bank and charge accounts had been inactive since early July. That didn't make sense if she was alive. They discovered that her husband, who was still unreachable on a business trip, would collect a $200,000 life insurance policy if anything happened to his wife. Detectives began to suspect that the couple's financial woes might spell more than a simple missing persons case. As the investigation continued, Lisa's son was doing a little detective work of his own. Kai Lau found his mother's address book in her bedroom. That was odd because she seldom went anywhere without it. He also noticed that furniture in the house was missing or rearranged. called Detective Turner.
Hi, Detective Turner.
Kai returned to the police station and met with investigators.
Look, I've also got this withdrawal.
He had found that $44,000 had been withdrawn from a bank account Lisa kept for his education.
Yeah, almost enough for a college tuition.
And that wasn't all.
Like I said, the money.
Kai told police his stepfather's gun was missing, and a sleep sofa had disappeared. He said his mother often slept on it when she and Gregory weren't getting along. Kai also informed detectives that his stepfather, Gregory, was due back from his business trip that evening. By now, investigators had a lot of questions for Gregory, too. They met him at the airport and brought him to the police station.
Officer, have a seat right here.
He was concerned about his wife and was eager to help police. He told them he bought Lisa a plane ticket to San Francisco so she could visit a friend in the hospital. He said he drove her to Dulles International Airport the next day and watched her board the plane.
You wouldn't lie to us, would you, Mr. Two?
Absolutely not.
He claimed she called from Los Angeles and said she was awaiting the flight to San Francisco. He hadn't heard from her since. When they told him Lisa's friend wasn't sick and wasn't expecting her, he seemed surprised.
So Lisa told me. Well,
Then he offered another explanation. He claimed his wife was unhappy with her appearance and wanted plastic surgery. He said they'd argued about it in the past. He surmised that might have been the real reason for the trip. Lisa probably made up the story of a sick friend, realizing he wouldn't buy the ticket if he'd known the truth. When detectives inquired about the missing sofa, Two said it was infested with mice and he had it hauled away. He also said he threw the gun away after a well-publicized local incident where a homeowner shot some trespassers. He explained away the $30,000 debt as business and travel expenses. Two begged off further questions, saying he was tired from his long trip. Detectives agreed to continue the interview another day if Two would take a polygraph test. He agreed and promised to return the following Monday.
Sure, you're pretty good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Gregory, too, didn't keep his appointment. He skipped town. To detectives, that seemed the act of a guilty man.
We then felt that the suspicions that the family had, that we had put together since the initiation of the investigation, now had come to fruition, and we were looking probably at a homicide.
Their suspicions about Gregory, too, grew even more when Kai brought them an Air Express letter from California. In it, Gregory claimed he was in Los Angeles looking for Lisa. If he didn't find her there, he planned to continue his search in San Francisco. Investigators considered the letter a self-serving excuse from a guilty man. But believing and proving are two different things. Without Lisa's body, there was no evidence she was dead. They began looking for proof in Gregory's story. Investigators followed up on Kai's tip about his missing college money and enlisted the help of the state's attorney's office. John McCarthy, deputy state attorney in Montgomery County, found Lisa had controlled it.
Gregory, too, cleaned out that account. We got bank photographs from the bank, and clear as day, you could see Gregory, too, stealing the $44,000 from that fund. And within a period of 10 days after he stole it, he had run through that money. It was gone.
Detective Turner re-examined the airline ticket to San Francisco. They learned it was possible for someone to check in, have the ticket marked, but not board the plane. He suspected Gregory, too, had done that, and that Lisa never boarded the plane. They contacted passengers who'd been on the flight. Then, Attorney McCarthy got a real break. A woman called to say she'd been on the plane with her husband and small child. While airborne, the couple took several photographs.
She says, well, I've got some pictures of the seat that Lisa 2 was supposed to be in on that plane from Washington to San Francisco, and she's not in those pictures. And she forwarded me those pictures, and one of the ways we were able to prove conclusively that Lisa was not on that plane that Gregory said she was on was with those pictures.
Detectives wanted to know more about the missing sofa sleeper. They wondered if Lisa's body was inside it when it was hauled away. They tracked down the men who picked it up. They remembered the couch because Gregory tipped them for carrying it out to the truck. They didn't notice anything unusual about it. Investigators traced it to the landfill, but that was a dead end. The sofa had already been ground up and buried. Detectives reasoned that Gregory might have gotten rid of the sofa because it contained proof of Lisa's death. If that were true, there could be other evidence at the residence. They obtained a search warrant to find out. An examination of Gregory's car uncovered incriminating evidence. Clumps of mud, weeds, and twigs were stuck in the undercarriage, indicating the car had been driven off-road. In the trunk, they found a plastic tarp, a carving knife, and a machete.
Mike, come over here. Look.
All of the items were clean, but they could have been used to dispose of a body. Inside the house, detectives found their first physical evidence of foul play. There were droplets of blood on a chair near the spot where the sofa had stood. But investigators suspected more might have been cleaned up. To find out, they processed the area with a Luma light, which makes blood that cannot be seen with the naked eye glow. They discovered blood spatters where the sofa had been, and it displayed a significant pattern.
We know that the couch was open at the time when this all occurred because there was no blood, swiping, or markings underneath the couch. It was a fold-away, opened-up couch, and when they put out the processing, you could basically see the outline of the couch opened up as a bed.
Investigators also found signs of smearing, evidence someone had tried to clean up the blood. While they were processing the scene, the phone rang. A car rental agency in Las Vegas was calling for Gregory 2.
Yes.
The car he rented several days before was overdue. It was the brake police were looking for. Now they finally knew where 2 was, but they needed some help in capturing him.
What I would like you to do is, if he calls in about the car in the next few days, or brings the car in, try to stall him, or if he calls in, tell him that you would like to replace the car with another car because this one needs reservice or whatever reason you can think of, or it's going to be resold, but somehow get him to come to the rental office to get another car.
Hello, my name's Greg.
The plan worked.
Yes, mister, we have an upgrade for you. Just a minute, please.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
On Saturday, September 10th, he arrived at the car rental office.
Yes, your car is ready.
It is?
Police arrested him on a fugitive warrant, nearly a month after he disappeared. Detectives Turner and Thompson flew to Las Vegas, where they began retracing 2's activities since he fled Maryland. A matchbook in his hotel room led them to a Chinese restaurant. The manager recognized 2 from a photograph. She told investigators he had applied for a job, saying his wife was dead and he wanted to start a new life. On the job application, he gave his name as Greg Sen. When the detectives returned home with 2, they called in a document examiner at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. They knew Gregory had used aliases. They wanted to confirm whether the handwriting on the job application and other items he wrote matched the bank slip closing Kai Lau's college account. The stolen money would provide the motive for the more serious crime of suspected homicide. After providing known samples of Tu's writing, detectives awaited the results of the document examination. The job application, bank slip, and other documents were compared against Tu's handwriting. In making the comparison, factors such as writing style, speed, and pressure are all studied. Document examiner David Sexton explains.
And it's a combination of those characteristics as well as a combination of recognizable letter formations and that combination of characteristics that are unique to the individual's handwriting.
The writing on the job application, bank slip, and other documents was Gregory Tu's.
Hi, how are you?
Police also consulted a forensic serology investigator about the blood spatters found at the Tu house. He confirmed they were consistent with a high-velocity wound, most likely from a gunshot. Despite all the evidence investigators had collected, their case was still flawed. They needed something solid to prove murder. Without Lisa's body, the only physical evidence they had was blood from the house.
In a divorce settlement.
They had to somehow tie it to the victim.
Kathy, Karen, and Linda, and
They had only one chance, and it was a long shot. To prove Lisa Tu had been murdered, Maryland investigators had to link her to the blood in the house. They hoped forensic DNA analysis could do that, but in 1988, it was still in its infancy. In fact, DNA evidence had only been used in a few trials nationally, none of them murder cases. And the Tu case posed a significant challenge. There were no known samples of Lisa Tu's DNA that could be used for comparison. Without them, it would be difficult to connect Lisa with the blood spatter. The DNA lab needed to perform a reverse paternity test, but this time they would have to work backward. They would determine Lisa's DNA from the blood of her son. Because Kai Lau was a genetic combination of both his parents, scientists could, in theory, forensically subtract his father's DNA from his blood. What remained would be Lisa's DNA profile. Blood was drawn from Kai Lau and from his father in Hong Kong for comparison. By process of elimination, the lab confirmed with 98 to 99% accuracy that blood found at the Tu house was Lisa's. With forensic DNA testing, detectives were able to prove homicide. Investigators believe Gregory Tu was moved to murder by jealousy over his wife's affair and the prospect of solving his financial problems with her life insurance. They pieced together a likely scenario for the night of July 14th. There were indications that the couple had argued, perhaps over the affair, perhaps about money. Desperate and enraged, Gregory Tu pulled his gun from the cabinet and shot Lisa. He then disposed of her body. Despite his protestations of innocence, Gregory Tu was convicted of first-degree murder on November 21st, 1989. He is currently serving a life sentence. Lisa Tu's body has never been found. Once, police had no chance of proving murder without a body. But today, they can make a case on forensic science, even when the victim has disappeared without a trace. A missing man surfaces in a Texas swamp. Strapped to his chest is a chilling record of his final minutes. Texas Rangers hope it will help unravel a case of double homicide. Police have a suspect in a cold-blooded killing, just not the technology to match him to the crime. Will science catch up to the killer before he slips away for good? When a body appears on the side of a Texas interstate, detectives hit the road to stop a homicidal trucker in his tracks. In Texas, there's plenty of room to hide. But killers in the Lone Star State, be warned. Even the swiftest of criminals can't escape the long arm of the Texas Rangers. On July 27, 1982, Texas Rangers were called to an abandoned car in a remote drainage ditch near Santa Rosa. The inside had been torched. A check of the plates showed that the car was registered to Billy Staton, who, along with his girlfriend, Letty Castro, had been missing for 10 days. It was the first break in the case, and one that Rangers desperately needed. Once the car was pulled from the swamp, investigators noticed something even more suspicious. A rock had been set on the accelerator. It appeared that a deliberate attempt had been made to get rid of the car and conceal a crime. But the fire and days of exposure to the elements had erased all fingerprints and ruined any chance of linking the crime to a suspect. The rock was the only clue authorities had to lead them to the missing couple.
Nothing there.
But if the condition of the car was any indication, things didn't look good for Billy Staton and Letty Castro. Texas Ranger Bruce Castile feared the worst.
Well, after finding the vehicle, we started an extensive search with numerous individuals searching canals, brushy areas in an attempt to find Letty Castro and Billy Staton. We felt like at that time that they had been murdered.
Rangers combed the area for the bodies, certain that they couldn't be too far from the scorched car. They trudged through miles of dense brush along the drainage ditch for any sign of the couple. After 4 days of searching, they still had found nothing. But the Rangers weren't discouraged. They'd built a reputation on their ability to solve extremely difficult cases. The Texas Rangers were organized in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin to protect the first settlers of Texas from Indians. 50 years later, in the rowdy days of the Wild West, the Rangers earned their name as tough lawmen by tracking down bandits, bank robbers, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers. Today, Rangers are as tenacious as ever. As a state police agency, they're highly trained in investigative and forensic techniques to assist local law enforcement. The Texas Rangers tackle only the biggest and most complex criminal cases. And the simple missing persons case was becoming more difficult with every day. Rangers questioned Letty Castro's brother, who told authorities that he last saw the couple on July 16th, when he stopped by the trailer she shared with Billy Staton. That was the same day they left to pick up Staton's 9-year-old daughter at his ex-wife's house. The two were going to be married soon and hoped to obtain full-time custody of the girl. But their dreams disappeared just as quickly as they did. The Rangers also learned from Letty Castro's brother of the Statons' ugly custody battle. Billy Staton retained rights to keep his daughter every other weekend. His ex-wife Sherry didn't like to comply. Pickups were an especially distressing time. On checking up on Staton's ex-wife, rangers learned that Sherry and her new husband, Paul Wolf, had moved the day after Billy Staton and Letty Castro disappeared.
Probably within about 4 or 5 days, would be my guess.
When rangers caught up with him, they claimed that Staton never showed up to pick up his daughter.
You bet. Just keep me posted, George. Good to see y'all. Take care. You bet.
The rangers obtained a warrant to search the home that Paul and Sherry had vacated. A damp spot on the carpet encouraged detectives to probe a little further. What they found was puzzling. A small area on the back side of the carpet had been painted over. It seemed like a deliberate attempt had been made to cover something up. Sections of the carpet were shipped to the lab to see if technicians could determine anything. Agents tested the carpet. So they wouldn't destroy potential evidence, they removed some of the residue with a cotton swab. A chemical that changes color in the presence of blood was then added to the swab. The test was positive. The blood was human. Because of the limits of technology in 1982 and the contamination by the paint, they could not determine whose blood it was. But they discovered that the carpet contained a lot of it, and someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide it. Upon closer examination at the house, investigators discovered tiny spatters of blood on the walls and curtains. They collected samples to send to the lab. If the bodies were ever found, the blood types could be compared. Something had definitely happened in the house. But the most interesting piece of evidence was found outside the home. It wasn't so much evidence as the absence of evidence, but it was rock solid. Ranger criminalist Joe Marchand uncovered precisely what had happened.
And we looked around and we finally found an indentation next to a tree where a rock used to be. So we went ahead and we had the rock at the time, and we went back and we basically fit it back as a jigsaw puzzle and put it back in its place.
Putting these pieces together, the Rangers turned to Paul Wolf, the husband of Billy Staton's ex-wife. This time, he changed his story. Paul now admitted that Billy and Letty Castro had arrived to pick up Billy's daughter. He told Rangers that Sherry and the girl weren't home when Billy arrived. Billy was so mad to find that his daughter wasn't there that he attacked Paul. Paul tried to defend himself and accidentally killed Billy with a metal bar. Billy's fiancée, Letty, heard the commotion and came running in. When she saw Billy on the floor covered with blood, she came after Paul. Once again, Paul Wolf said he beat her in self-defense, accidentally killing her too. Shocked and scared by what he'd done, Paul asked a buddy, Glenn Henderson, to help him dump the bodies in a drainage ditch. To get rid of Billy's car, he'd brought a large rock along to set on the accelerator, hoping to get the car to drive itself into the ditch. But it hadn't worked the way he'd planned, so he returned the next day and burned it. Paul Wolf admitted that he had lied the first time because he was confused and wasn't sure the Rangers would buy his story. Wolf then directed investigators to the bodies. Letty Castro's body was found floating in a drainage ditch 12 miles from where the car was located. Her skull showed the damage Paul Wolf described, but rangers also saw that she'd been shot in the head. It didn't match Wolf's confession. Clearly, he was lying. About 10 miles away, Billy Staton's body was found, partially submerged in a steep canal. His head was crushed. When the body was dragged out, the detectives made a peculiar discovery. Under his shirt, strapped around his waist, was a mini tape recorder. It was in bad shape from the water, but the cassette inside was still intact. It was a puzzling find. Rangers couldn't explain why Billy wore a tape recorder to his ex-wife's house, but they knew there was the possibility that Billy Staton had recorded his own murder. The Texas Rangers believed that the clue that would seal their case was taped to Billy Staton's body. The tape recorder found on the victim was treated with tremendous care. Days of water and mud had ruined most of the mechanism. But crime scene analyst Joe Marchand was hopeful about salvaging the cassette.
The most fascinating piece of evidence that we found was the tape recorder that was strapped to Billy Staton's stomach. We pulled the tape out. We called the FBI laboratory and asked them, what are we supposed to do? And they said, has it been submerged in water? Partially. They said, good, put it back in water and send it to us in a container. And it's better to be in water than letting the tape dry out.
After 10 long days, the tape was returned to the Texas Rangers. The FBI had done their best to save whatever had been recorded, but it was still uncertain whether it contained anything vital to the case. Within seconds of playing it, the sounds of Billy Staton being brutally murdered were perfectly clear. Armed with the recording, investigators went back to the scene of the crime to precisely match actions to audio. They measured distances and timed out the events as they corresponded to the sounds on the tape. The blood found in the house had been matched to Billy Staton. Now, the patterns of the blood would tell more of the story. All the bloodstains on the wall had tiny tails, like teardrops. By studying and measuring those tails, examiners could determine exactly what angles the blood had come from. Combined with the audio tape, they could then piece together where Billy was in the room at the time he was beaten.
Now I want you to go ahead and pass it on to Roll.
The tape revealed to investigators exactly what happened that afternoon. Billy Staton showed up at the house and was invited in.
Billy's here.
Sherry Wolf and her daughter are clearly heard on the tape, refuting Paul's claims that they weren't home when Billy arrived. Detectives learned that soon after Billy's arrival, Wolf took out the trash. But the trash was just an excuse to get outside. He really just wanted to see if Billy had brought Letty with him, and he needed to grab the crowbar he'd hidden earlier. From the way the blood had spattered on the walls, and by listening carefully to the tape, it was obvious to Rangers that Billy Staton had no idea what was about to happen. He was seated, waiting patiently, when Paul Wolf struck. Wolf's accomplice, Glenn Henderson, had been hiding in another room. Once their victim was slumped on the floor, the two went out to murder Letty, who was waiting in the car. Without a doubt, Paul Wolf's self-defense plea was a lie. These were cold-blooded attacks on unsuspecting people. While the tape continued to roll, the killers carried Billy out to his car and put him in the trunk. They knew they'd need to get rid of the car as well as the bodies, and they took the rock with them. The fact that the murder weapons were planted and an accomplice was on hand helped to prove that these weren't spur-of-the-moment murders. They were planned in advance. Of course, what they didn't plan on was capturing their crime on tape.
And this is where they're looking. This is where they're looking to see where they're going to dump Letty. And you can hear the rocks hitting the bottom of the trunk, and they're traveling slow speed.
Wolf found a secluded area off a drainage ditch a few miles from the house. Glenn Henderson followed in his truck. The site was far off the road, and the grass was high enough to conceal a dead body. But something was wrong. Letty Castro was still alive. The killers, however, were prepared for such a hitch.
On the tape, you hear a single gunshot. Then you hear some yelling, which is inaudible. Then you hear the car door close in the vehicle and take off, and approximately 30 seconds later the tape runs out.
For some reason, they decided not to dump both bodies at the same spot. They left their next victim 9 miles down the road. The car was disposed of just as Wolf had described. The hard work was over. Back at the house, there was quite a bit of cleaning to do. In the short time they'd left their victim inside, struggling for life, a large pool of blood had collected on the carpet. The co-conspirators had to rent a professional carpet cleaner to cover their tracks. But even that wasn't enough. Blood had seeped through the carpet, staining the underside. In an attempt to conceal it, they painted over the spots. To put the crime behind them, the Wolfs went so far as to move out of the house the day after the murders. But nothing they could do would erase the evidence that Billy Staton had unwittingly recorded. Rangers discovered that Billy had worn the recorder on his lawyer's advice. He'd wanted to capture the appalling confrontation and Sherry's malicious behavior, hoping it could help him obtain custody of his daughter. Instead, he recorded his own murder. Paul and Sherry Wolf were both sentenced to life in prison for killing Billy Staton and Letty Castro. For his part, Glenn Henderson also received a life sentence. Most criminals unintentionally leave evidence behind, evidence that can condemn. But sometimes the proof is worthless. When even the latest technology can't finger a killer, all detectives can do is wait until science catches up. It was the morning of January 22nd, 1988, when Texas Rangers were summoned to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County. They'd been called to check up on an elderly woman who lived by herself. Neighbors couldn't reach her on the phone. There was concern that something might have happened. They were right. 72-year-old Lydia Schumacher had been murdered. Inside, Rangers discovered the gruesome scene. Schumacher lay partially nude on her bed. The sheets were bloody. She'd been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin was called in to process the house for evidence. Someone had clearly broken in the back door, and it seemed some jewelry was missing. Apparently, Mrs. Schumacher had surprised a burglar. There were no fingerprints to be collected, and the weapon used to beat her couldn't be found. It was likely that she was smothered with her own pillow. Officers turned their attention to the body and the bed. Serologist Donna Stanley, an expert in biological evidence, examined the crime scene and found signs that the victim had been raped.
So what we then did was we began to unravel the bed sheet by sheet. And from doing that, we covered any hair that we saw on the sheets and the bedspread. That was where it became apparent at that moment that we might have been dealing more with more than just with a homicide, that we might have had a sexual assault involved.
To track down the killer, rangers began interviewing people in the area for any information. Within a week, rangers had questioned all of Schumacher's friends and neighbors. No one could understand who could rape and murder such a sweet old woman. But eventually, 3 names came up of men who, for one reason or another, were considered suspicious by their neighbors. Detectives asked the men if they'd be willing to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought into the station, hooked up to the machine, and asked point blank if they murdered Schumacher or had any knowledge of the murder. Texas Ranger Bob Cannell was in charge of the case.
We had several suspects in the course of the investigation. One of them was a next-door neighbor, and another one was a person who was later picked up for indecent exposure.
2 men were questioned and released. The third suspect was a young man named Charles Supak Jr. Supak and his father had actually been doing some work at the Schumacher house on the day she was murdered. A background check revealed he'd once been charged with sexual assault. He was subjected to a thorough interrogation about the crime, but he denied any involvement whatsoever. The polygraph confirmed that Supak was telling the truth.
No, sir.
All 3 suspects had passed the test, and rangers were now left empty-handed. With no more leads, all they could do was hope to make the best of what they had so far.
Pretty good.
At the crime lab in Austin, Donna Stanley and her colleagues ran tests on the biological evidence left by the rapist.
Characteristics in the air that I feel very.
Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it to hair samples taken from the 3 suspects.
The medullary structure, the cuticle.
Out of the 3 suspects that I tested, 2 of them were immediately eliminated. The third remained as an inclusion in the blood typing test, and that was Supak. He was not eliminated on ABO typing.
In 1988, ABO blood typing narrowed down evidence to one of only 8 blood types. But with hundreds of millions of people sharing Supak's type, the test results were hardly enough to prove anything. Still, it was all they had to work with, so rangers brought Supak in again. He had passed the first polygraph test, but investigators were confident that if he were guilty, Supak couldn't beat the machine twice in a row. They decided to try again. It wasn't difficult finding him. He was sitting in jail for possession of marijuana.
Did you rape
Rangers
Mrs.
felt that if
Schumacher?
he'd been under the influence of drugs during the first
Did you
test,
kill
he
Mrs.
could have
Schumacher?
possibly lied and still passed.
On the second go-round, he had been in jail for several days, and we knew that he had to be clean at that time. So we took him back for the second polygraph to the same operator, and he passed that one too.
No other evidence was found that could pin the murder on Supak. Authorities had no choice but to clear him of the charges. For nearly a year, Rangers struggled to find Schumacher's killer, but it was hopeless. On November 29, 1988, they finally had to suspend the case. A rapist and murderer roamed somewhere in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Rangers were powerless to stop him. It had been 3 years since Lydia Schumacher was brutally raped and murdered. The only suspect was cleared of all responsibility, and the case sat on the shelf collecting dust. But by 1991, science had advanced enough to warrant another look at the case. Serologist Donna Stanley from the Texas Ranger Crime Lab felt that the new technologies held promise.
We still had a little bit of evidence left, kind of hanging on to it, hoping that as a new technology came along, we might then be able to apply this evidence to that new technology and gain, yet again, some more information. I need to pull that file for some new
The first comparisons made between suspect Charles Supak's hair and body fluids found at the crime scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had done all they could do. But since the initial investigation, a revolutionary new method for analyzing DNA had been developed. Called PCR, it enables scientists to get DNA from tiny samples, like a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something they could never do before. Stanley was optimistic that the evidence collected from the Schumacher house 3 years earlier could finally be used to nail the killer.
You're welcome.
Okay, see you around.
Shortly after the case had closed, Sheriff Cannell had retired, and Texas Ranger Ray Kaufman took his place. Kaufman approved further investigation of the evidence and quickly reopened the file.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob.
At the time I got involved in the Schupak murder, I knew that DNA was making giant leaps in their ability to narrow down suspects, and I felt that this case was one that possibly DNA could help solve.
As the preserved evidence was sent to a genetics lab, Rangers began questioning neighbors and relatives again, hoping to uncover more information about Charles Supak. They soon learned things about their suspect they'd never heard before. Shocking facts that made authorities only more suspicious than ever. Neighbors confided that Supak had quite a disturbing reputation. It was widely reported that he had unusual sex habits, including bestiality. But the most helpful information came from a man who recalled a strange and frightening night with Charles Supak. About 4 months after the murder, John Goldson was awakened late one night by Charles Supak. He told Goldson that he'd had car trouble and needed help. But something about Supak's manner didn't seem right. John reluctantly agreed to drive him back to his car.
Where are we going? Man, just go on out this way.
While they drove around aimlessly, trying to find the car, Goldson's suspicions slowly turned to fear. Supak had insisted on sitting directly behind Goldson and spent the entire drive idly wrapping an electrical cord around his hands. Supak finally directed Goldson to a remote area, but when they arrived, his vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Tired of the whole affair, Goldson finally drove him to a garage. When Goldson got home, he still felt uneasy. He and his wife inspected the grounds and found that their phone lines had been cut. The story took another chilling twist when Golson showed rangers where he'd driven Supak that night. Golson had no idea of the significance of the spot, but its importance didn't escape the rangers. Golson's trip with Supak led rangers to believe that their old suspect knew more about the Schumacher murder than he'd admitted.
This is the final location where Mr. Schupak brought Mr. Golson that night. Schupak said he'd parked his vehicle down or got it stuck down here by this tree line. This little lane here goes down to the Schumacher residence. It's maybe a quarter of a mile right down here.
Supak had returned to the Schumacher estate. Rangers knew it was common for a killer to revisit the crime scene, but it would take more than this circumstantial evidence to put the finger on Charles Supak. The lab had run complex DNA tests, comparing Supak's sample to the evidence from the Schumacher case. Finally, on March 8, 1992, the results came in. The DNA of Charles Supak Jr. was in the victim's bed sheets. The updated information finally gave Texas Rangers the evidence they needed to arrest the man they'd suspected for over 5 years. Once again, he was in another Texas county jail for vehicle theft. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Supak admitted to raping and murdering Lydia Schumacher. In his confession, Supak told Rangers that on January 20th, 1988, he and his father had finished some work they'd been doing around Mrs. Schumacher's house and were ready to call it a day. They'd spent nearly a week on the property, and Charles had been inside the house enough to know that Mrs. Schumacher owned some gold jewelry. He figured there had to be more valuables somewhere in the house. That night, Supak returned. He claimed he'd been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of Mrs. Schumacher. Her house was terribly secluded, and she was elderly and defenseless. The house was quiet when he arrived, and getting in was easy. He'd left a pipe in the yard that day. Now it was the perfect tool, and soon it would be the perfect weapon. Once inside, the prowler had a look around. He snuck into her bedroom and began rifling through her things when she awoke. Supak reacted by beating her in the head with the pipe. Before he left, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. It took nearly 5 years, but Charles Supak Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of Lydia Schumacher. The conviction was a tribute to Ranger tenacity, as much as it was a victory of hard science.
Forensic science basically solved this case. If it hadn't been for the advances in DNA, I'm sure this would still be a pending case that would go unsolved.
It's easier to catch a killer, even years after his crime, if he stays put. But Rangers take pride in their ability to track down suspects on the run. In a state as big as Texas, it's a common situation. There's usually not much to see on Interstate 35 between Dallas and Oklahoma. But on August 8, 1994, that changed. A Cook County police officer spotted a body on the roadside near the Oklahoma state line. When Texas Rangers arrived on the scene, they found a dead white male in his 30s. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, neck, and face. Wrapped around his neck was a shoelace. There was a sock stuffed in his mouth. Judging from the condition of his body, it looked like he had been thrown from a moving vehicle. A bra and a baseball cap were discovered nearby. A pair of men's underwear were also recovered. They were obscure clues, but it was enough to start Rangers down the right road. Officers searched the body, but found no wallet or ID. The murder victim was transported to the lab, where fingerprints were taken for identification. The task of tracking down the killer fell to Texas Ranger Johnny Waldrop. Within 2 days, he received a positive identification of the victim from the fingerprints. He was a 38-year-old Dallas man. His name was James Sykes.
James Sykes had a real bad criminal history and was just a kind of a throwaway person. He didn't have any family background other than his parents, and had no money and had no job, and was a very bad drug addict and an extensive criminal history. Roadblocks we ran into is through the investigation. We would contact people and they would say, "Why do you care?" Well, we did care because he was an individual just like everyone else.
Door.
Sykes hung with a rough crowd. When officers tracked down his best friend, Murray Bracken, he was in a Dallas County jail on a drug charge, and he became the Rangers' first suspect. Bracken admitted that he'd been with Sykes just the day before his body was discovered. He even acknowledged that the baseball cap found at the scene belonged to him. But he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. Bracken recounted that he and Sykes were partying at a motel when they met a truck driver and his girlfriend. The four used up Bracken's drugs, and at the end of the party, he asked the truck driver to pay his share. The truck driver didn't have the money with him, but said he could go get it. James Sykes went with the couple to make sure they didn't just take off. That was August 7th.
Murray sent Sykes with the truck driver to collect the money. The truck driver, for some unknown reason, gave his billfold with his driver's license to Bracken and said, "I'm from Ada, Oklahoma. I'm a truck driver. I've got to be in Phoenix in a couple of days, and this is good faith. I will leave my billfold with you, showing you that I'll come back with the money."
They never returned. And Murray Bracken said he emptied the trucker's wallet and threw away his driver's license. Unfortunately, that was the one piece of evidence that would have supported his story and provided a solid lead for Rangers. Now it was gone forever. To see if Bracken was telling the truth, Waldrop called the Oklahoma Department of Motor Vehicles to check for truckers who'd applied for duplicate licenses in the last few days. The DMV gave him a list. On it was a man named Terry Brown. He was from Ada, Oklahoma. Police records revealed that Brown had been stopped on a traffic violation shortly before the murder. At the time, he was driving a truck registered to a freight company in Carrollton, Texas. He finished his job and returned the truck to the company. But shortly afterwards, someone stole it off the lot. Brown was arrested for driving the stolen rig 2 days later, but was released on bond. Dallas police sent Waldrop his mugshot.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Rangers put the picture in a stack of photos and asked Murray Bracken to survey the lineup. Within moments, he recognized the trucker he'd last seen with his friend. He pointed out Terry Brown. The investigation was picking up steam, but to prove Brown was the killer, Rangers needed more than just the word of a criminal. They needed proof. The freight company was relieved to get their stolen truck back. Only now it was the major piece of evidence in a crime far worse than theft. It matched a description Bracken had given authorities, and they were beginning to believe that it was in the truck that James Sykes had taken his last ride. The Dallas Police Crime Lab was called in to search the vehicle for any signs that the victim had been inside. Rangers knew Brown had been in the cab. He was arrested in it. Trucking records showed he was driving on business until August 6th. Sometime after that, he returned to the lot and stole the truck. The company reported the rig missing, and it was recovered on the 8th, the same day the body was found. Everything pointed to Terry Brown as the killer, but Brown had jumped bail. No one knew where he was. The team scoured the cab and sleeper for clues. They got what they were looking for. In the back, on the walls, investigators found some small spots of what appeared to be blood. Careful examination revealed even more blood under the mattress. Some quick tests indicated that it was human. Detectives were sure that further testing would reveal it to be the blood of James Sykes. The evidence was bagged and sent to the lab for DNA testing. Rangers were confident they were now on the trail of the man responsible for the brutal stabbing. At the lab, criminalist Wilson Young used DNA testing to compare the blood to that of the victim. But what he found shocked Rangers and presented a major roadblock to the investigation.
We did a type on it, we did a DNA type on it, and found that actually from that rig that we investigated at that particular time, the blood didn't match the victim that we were looking for. We had some blood here, but didn't match the person we were supposed to match.
They'd found blood in the truck, but it wasn't the blood they'd expected to find. Apparently, someone else might possibly have been murdered there. Then Ranger Waldrop received news that only complicated issues further.
Another female was found, and she had a ligature around her neck and a sock in her mouth. And of course, we found Sykes with a ligature string around his neck, a sock in his mouth. So my initial gut reaction was that Murray Bracken was telling the truth, and that we probably have a serial killer out there driving a truck.
The case had taken an unexpected turn. At least 2 people were dead, and a serial killer was loose on the interstates of America. If Waldrop didn't catch up to him soon, there would almost certainly be more dead bodies to identify down the road. The Texas murders didn't stop. On November 7th, Ranger Waldrop received a call from police in Richardson, Texas, a town just north of Dallas. They'd just found another body. It was a woman with a string tied around her neck and a sock stuffed in her mouth. But this time, there was a twist. The dead woman was Terry Brown's mother. Brown and his girlfriend, Tina Sampson, were prime suspects in the murder. They had stolen his mother's car and disappeared. When Waldrop talked to Brown's last employer, he discovered that Brown was supposed to have delivered a load to California. He'd picked up their truck on November 6th, the day before the murder, and never returned. Once again, Terry Brown had stolen a rig and vanished.
We were very fortunate at this time. We finally had a turn of luck. This was the truck we were looking for. We found that he drove the truck to Oklahoma City and partied in it for a few days, and it ran out of gas and he left it. The Oklahoma City police found the truck abandoned.
Before rangers had time to respond, the trucking company brought the semi back to Texas and had it cleaned. The crime lab was sent to search for any possible clues that might have survived the cleaning. Fortunately, the company hadn't wiped away all the evidence. Stains in the sleeper under the mattress were found that were most likely caused by blood. Judging by the size of the stains, it appeared that a lot of blood had seeped through the mattress onto the platform. But this was clearly a brand new mattress. The company had thrown out the old one, and with it some evidence vital to the murder case. Through a stroke of luck, the trash hadn't been collected yet, and among the trash was an old, stained mattress. The large stains looked like blood and matched the stains in the truck. But detectives were concerned that days of exposure had taken its toll on the evidence. Everything was shipped to a lab in Austin for detailed analysis. At the lab, DNA was extracted from the evidence. The strands were chemically cut into smaller pieces. This allowed for an extremely precise comparison between the blood found in the truck and the sample from James Sykes.
I'm going to need the light out.
By comparing the DNA fragments, technicians confirmed that the blood could match only one person in the entire world: James Sykes.
We were certain that the victim's blood was in the truck. In fact, I mean, when you look at the numbers, 1 in 5.5 billion, that pretty much indicates that that particular person was the only one that could leave the blood behind in the truck.
Terry Brown and Tina Sampson were found the next day. Dallas police caught up with the couple in his mother's stolen car, headed east.
We'll find that out in the court of law.
They were split up and interrogated separately.
She's telling the truth right now.
Once the evidence was presented before them, investigators were finally told the true story of what happened to James Sykes.
He was trying to rape Tina. She had him by knife point.
To make sure they paid what they owed, Sykes had gone with them to collect the money. Brown drove to a truck stop and told Sykes to wait in the truck while he went to get the cash. But Sykes grew impatient and decided to collect his money another way. According to the killers, he climbed in the back and demanded sex from Tina Sampson. She panicked and pulled a knife to defend herself. When Brown returned and saw the two arguing, he assumed Sykes was trying to rape his girlfriend. In a fit of anger, he grabbed the knife and stabbed Sykes. Sampson said she was so upset, she took the knife and stabbed him some more. Brown wrapped a ligature around his victim's neck and stuffed a sock in his mouth. Sampson said they left his body in the back for a while until they were ready to dispose of him.
And she told us about how they had driven around a couple of days later, had partied some more, done some more drugs, while he was in the sleeper of the truck, and that they later decided to go to Oklahoma City. And along the route, she didn't know where they were, but they pulled up on the side of the interstate, and that Terry had got in the sleeper and just with his feet had pushed the body out the side door on the long side of the interstate, and then they went to Oklahoma City.
Though investigators couldn't get a conviction for the other two murders, Tina Sampson got 20 years for conspiracy to murder, and Terry Brown got life in prison for the death of James Sykes. The determination of the Texas Rangers paid off.
Well, this case, I think, epitomizes the Rangers that we have done for so many years. There's a very old Ranger saying that a man in the wrong cannot stand up against a man in the right that keeps on coming. And that's what we did in this case. We kept on coming.
The Rangers made their reputation over 100 years ago by stubbornly chasing criminals through all sorts of terrain, using any weapon available. And they're still at it, armed with the power of forensic science. Killers may continue to run from the law, but with technology as their sidekick, the Texas Rangers will never stop their relentless pursuit.